Gentlewoman from New Hampshire yields back the balance of her time. Gentlewoman from California or from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Pelosi, the Minority Leader of the House.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. The time is late. The cause is great. We must have clarity in how we understand what is before us. Today, we had an opportunity to work together to address the humanitarian emergency at the border. Instead, it is a day of missed opportunity. The Republican leadership has rejected our hand of friendship to compromise on this supplemental. Instead of bringing legislation forward that could solve this problem really and truly, it has resisted the appeals of humanitarian and religious leaders across all faiths. The evangelical immigration table calls on us to ensure that our response strengthens our country's tradition of providing safety and refuge to the vulnerable. This legislation that we have before us does not do that. It is wrong. But don't take my word for it. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops urges members to oppose 5230 and work together to craft legislation that is more befitting the United States of America and the American people's history of compassion and generosity to vulnerable children and refugees. The Archbishop of Miami, Thomas Wensky, speaking on their behalf, has said, of this legislation, the two pieces of legislation before us, this is a sad day for our country, the Archbishop wrote. A Chamber of Congress is poised to send vulnerable children back to danger and possible death. It violates our commitment to human rights and due process of the law and lessens us as a nation. That's what the Archbishop said. In their letter, the bishops further state their opposition to H.R. 5232 and say that it stems from its elimination of the Deferred Action for Children's Arrivals Program, otherwise known as DACA. In conclusion, the bishops write, how our nation responds to this humanitarian challenge is a moral test of our national character. We ask that you oppose H.R. 5230 and 5232, which we feel fail to live up to that test. Others, such as the American Bar Association, writes, due to their age, lack of education, language, and cultural barriers, and the complexity of U.S. immigration law, these vulnerable children face insurmountable obstacles to proving their claims before an immigration judge on their own. It is the children who are most likely to be eligible for some relief under the law who may least be able to articulate their experiences under this proposed procedure. They've been through a lot of trauma, and we want to add to that. Yet, this has not been enough to stem what the House Republicans have, the path they're going down. To further poison the pie, they offer their caucus the chance to even be less compassionate in their vote to end DACA and to deport the Dreamers. It's not enough for Republicans to send desperate children back to the violence of their home countries. They must also vote to deport the best young immigrants and brightest in our schools. Vote to send victims of domestic violence back to their abusers. Vote to hand witnesses back to drug lords. Vote to remove the parents of American children. These pieces of legislation dishonor America. They are a rejection of our values. But don't take it from me. Take it from the bishops, the evangelical table, and others. They run counter to the respect for the spark of divinity that we believe exists in every person, the respect for the dignity and worth of every person that we share. But these pieces of legislation ignore. House Republicans have truly lost their way. I certainly hope that you will consider rereading the parable of the Good Samaritan who helped a stranger. He did not ignore or harm a stranger he saw on the road. Perhaps that may be a path back for you. I pray that is so. Mr. Speaker, I want to submit for the record the letter of the bishops, the evangelical table, the ABA, and the list of hundreds of organizations, faith-based and due process-oriented, who oppose these pieces of legislation. Urge my colleagues to vote no and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for his dedication and his hard work to finding a solution to a problem that none of us created here in this chamber. And I rise today in strong support of this supplemental appropriations bill for the crisis that's going on our border. I'm very proud of our conference this week, seeking input and solutions from members, taking the time to make sure that this legislation deals with the problem, and crafting this legislation to make sure that there's no loopholes and that we deal with the specifics, and we actually put a bill on the floor that should be supported. Mr. Speaker, the Obama administration has ignored the law and unilaterally established immigration policy without the consent or the counsel with Congress. So unfortunately, the humanitarian crisis on our nation's southern border is the result in the lack of leadership. To solve this problem, this legislation today, the legislation that's here that we're debating, provides critical funding for the National Guard on those states that are seeing an influx. It also authorizes additional judges to hear the increasing caseload that they're seeing grow and grow more and more every day. It also makes important reforms to current law to ensure equal and timely due process for all of those unaccompanied minors. Mr. Speaker, common sense doesn't often prevail here in Washington, but I can tell you that common sense Hoosiers in my district, they understand that first of all, our border needs to be secure so that our immigration system can then be reformed. And you know, we are a nation of immigrants. We all have a history in our families of those who have taken the effort, made the effort to come to this great country. And legal immigrants are looking for those opportunities that they've dreamed of. I thank Chairman Rogers for his work, and I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker, to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I sat here quietly listening to the arguments from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I find it absolutely amazing that they say because the President would not sign this bill and because the Senate would not pass this bill. They're right, the Senate wouldn't pass it. There are hundreds of bills on Harry Reid's desk that he would not bring to the floor for a vote. And certainly the President would not encourage that to be done. But we are doing our job here in the House. We put a lot of time and effort in this. We looked at this law and we realized what had to be done. I come from a law and order background, and we don't have law and order. We have distrust, we have gangs coming across, we have drugs coming across the southern border, and my colleagues on the other side don't want to do anything about it. You know something that I find quite interesting about the other side? Under the leadership of the former Speaker and under the leadership of their former leader, when in 2009 and 2010 they had the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they knew this problem existed, they didn't have the strength to go after it back then, but now are trying to make a political issue out of it now. What we need to do is pass this legislation, make sure that these children get back to their families, and we need to line up and protect this border from people coming across.
Gentleman will
Yes,
continue.
it is true. I did the research on it. You might want to try it. You might want to try it, Madam Leader. Do the research on it. Do the research. I did it. That's one thing that you don't do.
Gentleman will address his comments to the
Well, then,
Speaker.
it works both ways, Mr.
Gentleman will
Speaker.
continue. The gentleman is recognized.
With that, I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation because apparently I hit the right nerve. I yield back.
Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Washington, Adam Smith.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
What is she doing? Where is he? Who? I think he left the room. We left?
Gentleman from Washington is
We left? Okay.
Gentleman is correct. The House will be in order.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Washington will be recognized.
she said she'd rather you do.
Recognized for 1 minute.
What is she called?
Thank you. I rise in opposition to this bill and also to the bill that will follow. We have a humanitarian crisis.
Gentleman is correct. Gentleman will suspend. The House is not in order. The House will be in order. Members will take their seats or remove their conversation from the House floor. The gentleman is recognized.